name's Professor Kylie O'Brien, and I'm joined at our Considering Cannabis podcast by my colleague, Dr. Carolyn Bozak. So welcome, everyone. And in today's show, we're going to be talking with Kevin Jodrey from the US. So welcome, Kevin.
Thank you so much for having me on board.
So Kevin has so many hats on, it's not funny. He's a consultant, he's an educator, he's a speaker, he's a cultivator and a judge for the Emerald Cup as well. Now, he's been involved in the initial CBD research in the US. He's done a lot of work mapping cannabis genotypes. He's got his own grow facility called Wonderland Nursery where he cultivates cannabis. And he provides expertise to a range of companies around the world. So I guess let's kick this off. Carolyn, I believe you wanted to ask Kevin a couple of questions.
Well, everyone's always got a story in this space. So, Kevin, what was your pathway in getting involved in the cannabis industry?
Wow. We have to go all the way back into 1978. It's ironic because at that time cannabis was so highly regulated, very illegal, but it was very prevalent in the area I lived in. And my mom was a scientist, and so I think I just inherited from her in the curiosity. And so I just had this curiosity about cannabis as a child, and I ended up never leaving. So I spent my entire life really working with cannabis to some degree.
What was the first sort of foray into the, I suppose, like where your role is now? What was the first step?
Well, I guess my role now is so varied in that fundamentally I'm always a cultivator. That's who I am first, as a cultivator, and that's really where my passion always came from, was in growing cannabis. But it really started to go into genetics and the work that I did. I've been involved my entire life, and so it's, if I tell the story, we're going to have to go and give you 40 years of backstory. But it's just really a fascination with the plant. And I was, as the more I uncovered, the mystery of it, the more I understood the relationship between people and cannabis and how it had this unbelievable relationship for 14,000 years. And so it let me realize that we had so much of the truth. And I had always hoped that as we went forward, science would be able to allow us to see better into what makes up cannabis and why have people had such an incredible relationship with it over these years.
Okay. I want to ask you a bit about the taxonomy or naming conventions before we jump into some of your research. So, and I also want to talk to you about your work mapping cannabis genotypes. So, you hear the word sativa dominant and indica dominant, and they're used to describe, I guess, different cultivars or hybrids of the different subspecies of the plant. So for people who are sort of new to the cannabis industry, what does it mean, or what's it supposed to mean in terms of therapeutic effect, these words sativa dominant and indica dominant? Do they mean anything?
Well, they do. They're all of cannabis falls under one family, which is cannabis sativa. And what happened was, as scientists started to discover variations in cannabis pertaining to latitude, where on the planet it was cultivated, they saw a different morphological trait, and they assumed it was different plants. But the reality of it is it's all one plant. And what people have to be aware of is that cannabis is shaped by two major factors: the environment, which means things that can actually exist and thrive in an environment, and the needs of the individuals who cultivate. And so when we talk about sativa, we're typically talking about things that are on the equator up to maybe, the 25 latitude, Tropic of Capricorn, Tropic of Cancer. And what we've noticed that when we look into those populations is things that come from that, things that we define as sativa, are things that typically have a more cerebral, ethereal effect. And it's in those regions, it's easy to understand, because when you come from a place where you have abundant water and food, your struggle isn't as difficult as one that it did not. And so the things that are ethereal, the things we mine in breeding to look for characteristics that are for uplifting, we mine from what we use incorrectly, the word sativa, but really it means from equatorial up to about 20 on the latitude. When we talk about indica, we're talking about broadleaf, and we're talking about things that come from the high deserts, the regions where you had very low water levels. High mountain desert is, under 10 inches of rain a year. And the needs were different. And so that's where we see more of a body relaxation. It's really where we see much higher levels of cannabidiol, CBD. And so for people that are, looking for cannabis, it's very confusing, because even when someone says it's a sativa or an indica on a package, it's really predominantly a hybrid. And it makes it confusing, because when we hybridize something, we change the chemotype, the chemical composition, enough that we change it into a different type of effect. But mostly what people need to realize is that cannabis was selected by populations for their own needs, to fit their desires, and the environment impacted what was able to be grown in those areas.
Okay, so you're sort of saying, well, look, where it was grown suits that particular population, but we can get fruit and vegetables at any time of the year, so we're not actually attuned necessarily to those cycles of nature so much anymore, are we? So how does that sort of in the US, for example, you have so many different cultivars available potentially all year round, I suppose. Mm-hmm. So that sort of idea about things evolving for particular populations and particular sort of regions of the world probably doesn't exist so much anymore, does it?
Well, to a degree, we still select for what we want, and populations discover things that they like and then recommend it amongst themselves. And yep. So for what I had done was, because of this unbelievable confusion and homogenization of gene pools, I had come up with a classification system of cannabis that we call the 4 categories of perception. Mm-hmm. And it's that over the course of my life, I noticed cannabis broke up into 4 main populations on how we perceive the scent. And those categorizations were fuel and earth, fruit and floral. Right. And created this categories of perception to make it easy to understand cannabis, because when we look at those categories, we can say that for people who want an aggressive experience where they want to be very high, fuel is where you would go. And if you wanted to be in a relaxing situation, you would go into an earth. If you wanted a contemplative, ethereal type effect, you would go into floral. Wanted something that was bright and light and uplifting, cheery, we would go into fruit. And my hypothesis was challenged by a scientific team from the University of California, Los Angeles, led by a scientist named Dr. John Abrams. And they challenged my hypothesis, and I gave them the data sets for that first competition. Had 250 entries. So we had enough data for them to take a look at it. And what Abrams discovered was that it really is a clear 4 breakup of cannabis and how we see it, but mostly it's due to a relationship between three major terpenes: beta-caryophyllene, myrcene, and limonene. But the bottom line is, when we look at cannabis, we can break it up into these 4 categories. And so what it does is it allows an individual to say, what am I taking? And if they went to the pharmacy, dispensary, whatever phrase we use, they'd be able to ask the individuals that worked, and they say, hey, what I want is something to help me relax in the evening. And they would be able to steer you into earth-based varieties, because what we have happen is we're trying to use major terpenes as indicators. But the problem, I had done a lot of research on terpene science with scientists I hired to try to map varieties using terpene profiles. And the problem is that minor terpenes, thiols, esters, and other non-sulfur volates, they have an ability to modify how we perceive that major terpene. And so what I realized that trying to use a major terpene as an identifier is not correct, and that we couldn't use it as mapping. And this was before genomic mapping existed. So I spent a couple years with the scientific team that I had hired, try to understand how do we map these different varieties. And what I realized was that our own senses were actually the best guide. And for me, from being in cannabis for so many years and being involved in nursery operations, production operations, breeding operations, storefront operations, the 4 categories were really clear to me as a pattern. And now it's in pretty wide usage where the Gangier program utilizes it as the cornerstone of evaluation. Books utilize it, competitions utilize it, businesses all over the world utilize it to help them understand how to diversify their product portfolio so they can make sure they always have adequate medicine for the individuals that need. And it's important to note because there was studies done by a doctor named Dr. Nasha, and he had done research on brainwave analysis pertaining to cannabis consumption. And what his research revealed was there was no change in brainwave analysis when different cannabis was used. And the team from University of California, Los Angeles, led by Dr. Abrams, saw that study and contacted him and said, let's do the study again, but this time let me provide you cannabis that falls under each one of the different categories. And he said, use different cannabis. And he said, no, you used a bunch of cannabis, but it was all under the same categorical breakdown. And what happened was Nasha was able to test, Abrams provided the cannabis, and now when you gave those patients the brainwave analysis on each one of the 4 categories, you had 4 radical brainwave results. Wow. So it allows us to be able to say that it doesn't only work in a simple form, but it just works, period. And it was just that I happened to be involved in cannabis for so long, I just saw the pattern naturally.
Okay, so I just want to backtrack a bit. So you've got fuel, earth, fruit, and floral, and they've got different effects. And you said that these effects seem to be based on 3 major terpenes, beta-caryophyllene, limonene, and myrcene. Have I got that right so far?
Correct. That's when you really break it down into, I want to say, almost AI-driven data software. Yep. That's where you can really see these relationships. And what we know is that as someone who runs nurseries and works with populations, the 4 divisions allow us to really kind of cover the needs of individuals, because the specificity of your cannabinoid profile, specificity of your secondary metabolite profile dies in the efficacy of your usage, but I can get you pretty close with the map.
Okay, so for the fruit, for example, you'd expect that would be higher in limonene, I'm guessing. Is that right? That sort of so you're talking about relative proportions of these 3 main Correct. Terpenes that gives you that gross, I guess, ability to sort of say, well, look, how do you characterize fuel? How do you characterize fruit? Well, you'll be characterizing it in terms of the relative proportions of those 3 major terpenes. Is that what you mean?
Yes, that's actually how it turned out, that there's really 3 major terpenes that make the influence occur. But the bottom line is, by itself as a dominant terpene doesn't necessarily indicate that it's going to be a fruit, because if I add enough of secondary terpenes, I can modify how that terpene is actually perceived by the user.
Okay.
Can you explain? So sometimes what I see is, like for say a product that will give you, for most patients, it will give you a couch lock, say, effect. But then you'll get some patients who have an idiosyncratic reaction, and it'll do the opposite, and it'll awaken them. Can you explain that?
Yeah, ultimately, people are individuals. And so what we have is outliers in every population, and there's no way to accurately say anything works for everyone. But what we can say is we can get you within this high range of accuracy that allows us to be able to take a look at the population, make recommendations, allow the individual to go through the population, and majority of the time we find satisfaction. But if we don't, then we know that individual has a unique system, and then it goes into, well, let's go check out the other categories. So it makes it really pretty straightforward, and it makes it easy for cultivators, nursery operators, stores, because what we do is we use these categories to identify markets. So if you are looking at an area where you have an extreme level of high-end business, say finance or data work, that's where you'll see the majority of floral strains sell. Floral varieties move because the people in those places want more of an ethereal. You'll take a look and you'll notice the older smokers typically like earth because it's what reminds them of their past. Newer smokers that are into high-powered cannabis go with fuel. And fruit is always for people who like light cannabis. And so what we would say is if you're selling to people that are in areas predominantly newer smokers, more suburban situations, that's where you see more of that fruit sell. So it helps you kind of target where you're going to see the proportion of cannabis sold. And we know this is true by data. So I can't with all of this, but data companies challenge it and then they prove it because I've been using it for so long that I know it works because it allows me to be able to make some assumptions based off of populations that typically go for certain cannabinoid, or we would call in this case, secondary metabolite profile, because cannabinoids and all other metabolites combined create that chemotype, the chemical composition of the plant that we'll really seek. Okay, so
taking that theory, I guess, which I can sort of see how that would work for the adult use market. And the adult use market it's a bit of a crossover with the medical market because some people are just using it to relieve stress, and stress can cause all sorts of chronic illnesses, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to necessarily make a clear distinction between the adult use, the recreational market, and the medical use. But as a clinician, I'm sort of thinking, okay, so if we looked at different diseases, for example, how do I then apply that categorization to work out which might be the best type of cultivar or flower that I would, recommend to a patient in a clinic? So has that been applied in a more clinical way? That's what I'm getting at, I think.
Well, to a degree, but what you have is it has to be a very specific variety. So as an example, I've owned dispensaries for almost 15 years, right? Mm-hmm. So 15 years I've had active dispensaries. And in all those 15 years, there's only one plant that I could ever worked with out of thousands and thousands that I could give to an individual. Mm. And if someone had a similar problem, which in this case was spasticity, any spasticity issues, be it from spinal cord trauma, be it from ALS, be it from MS, anything that was spasticity, this particular plant controlled the spasticity completely. Mm-hmm. And right now, in the United States, we have it at a DEA lab where the Drug Enforcement Agency has licensed multiple labs in the United States now to be able to do more in-depth research. And when they approached me, I sent this plant forward so that the laboratory at this level, these operations, I think they invest $300 million into their research facility to do this, they have the adequate science and data collection to be able to really start to take a look. But that's the only plant in all the plants out of thousands and thousands of different plants that I could say had a specific. What we noticed was, in general, that if we got the individual's endocannabinoid system stimulated, and typically we do that through acid form, which is non-heated. So acid-derived cannabinoids seem to have an incredible impact on the endocannabinoid system, which then stimulates the immune system. And right now, if you're looking at all the COVID research, and they're saying that hemp fights it, what they're saying is that the unconverted CBD and CBG acids. So the acids from these other cannabinoids seem to have this stimulating effect. And that's really the basis of all medical cannabis in California, where medical cannabis in California, which really started medical cannabis in the United States, was just based off of observation from people who had family members or loved ones or lovers that were dying of HIV. And what they noticed was that people who consumed cannabis that had HIV increased appetite. And so they just saw a correlation, and they started to provide cannabis to people who were struggling, because in San Francisco, it was the hotbed for the entire world, really, with issues. And so you have this situation where you're driving forward on using cannabis to stimulate and help. But when you started to have physicians look at it, they said, well, that's good, but we need something more clearly defined. And a doctor named William Courtney, who was really the first one in the United States to approach this, he believed that there was a fall off in human health when they banned cannabis in agriculture. So when hemp and all these products were pulled out of the world due to the drug war, animals were no longer consuming cannabinoid-rich food, and people were no longer getting cannabinoid stimulation through the consumption of those animals. And his data research tracked the decline of the human organism from that inception.
Wow.
And so it's important to note, because Courtney's one of the cornerstones of modern day cannabinoid medicine. And it was Courtney that approached me with this theory of, I believe that cannabis acid is the crucial element. And I believe that if we could get the acid from CBD dominant plants, we would be able to have incredible effects on people. And this is before anyone knew what CBD was. You couldn't explain it to someone. It had zero value. There was no worth. But when I sat down with Courtney and his team, it was such an incredible proposal of what was possible that I said, listen, I'll dedicate X amount of canopy in my operation to produce these products. And then we'll start to put together the surveys, and we'll start to bring patients into the dispensary. And what I saw in real time was an unbelievable change in effect on a multitude of people, regardless of the juice used. So I could juice any cannabis plant, and as long as I was giving them 15 mils of green juice a day, within 3 weeks, we would typically see the beginning of change. And his work was fundamental because it involved the development of the cultivar ACDC, and ACDC is the foundation of Charlotte's Web. And so some of the most famous plants in the world, the beginning of it came out of research and development done at my facility. And what we did was we open sourced all this material. And so we started to take things that we were creating and we put them into the world for free. And we allowed people to access the products so that we could start to get people to be able to take their own homeopathic health in hand. We realized from the experiments and all the research was that money was really one of the most devastating factors in health, because most people can't afford it. Yeah. And so we realized that if we could make it free, then what we would be able to do was we would be able to get an incredible number of people to approach it and work with us. And took place was we got to see thousands of people benefit from these type of forms. And it was used in as widely as to heal our foot, all the way to do a complete, tumor repair, where we would have individuals come in that were going through the oncology. They had been completely designated as stage cancer. They were scheduled for mastectomy. They were scheduled for some kind of removal, and they would come to us. And at that point, that's the best to work with because they have nothing to lose.
Yeah.
So they'll program completely. And what we saw was these unbelievable changes, and the doctors that were working on them could not believe the change in their T level counts and in the size of the tumors. And it started to bring the doctors into the program to say, hey, wait a second, we don't understand this, but we know that we diagnosed this woman with double breast cancer, and she no longer has.
So let me just jump in there. So are you still, when you talk about this program, you're still talking about cannabidiolic acid here? So you and tell me the best way to get that. You're talking about juicing, so that's something that anyone can do. They can put it in a blender and off you go. What about, so we've got some of this research you're telling us about now where CBD acid is a lot stronger than the decarboxylated form, and yet we've got a whole industry around decarboxylated CBD oil, haven't we?
What happened was you had an individual named Rick Simpson, and Rick Simpson was a farmer who developed cancer, and he needed to get his cannabinoid levels up, and because in some people you need to have such high levels, and it depends on what problem you have. That there is no one thing that works for all, but what we know is that everyone we worked with, we started them on unconverted cannabis. And what we knew is that was the most gentle way to go about it, because there was no psychoactive effects or any other effects. It was basically like you were drinking, juiced kale.
Smoothie, yeah.
It's smoothie. And so it was very, very easy for people to work with. Their fear level was low. But when you get into people that have, heavy colon cancer, what we're having to do is we're having to give them the acids, and then we're also having to give them, Rick Simpson is a process, not just a name. So if you're not using naphtha, you're really not making a Rick Simpson. But what you're doing is we just call it a full extract cannabis oil. And those products can be then utilized in suppository form to get around the liver, so that you can get enough of the material into the individual, because high pain that they need to have extremely high levels of THC to break the pain back. They need the acid to fight the cancer cells and get the endocannabinoids stimulated. And so you have to kind of understand what type of cancer. Certain cancers seem to be stimulated by THC. Some cancers seem to be stimulated by CBD. So the medical people and homeopathic healers have to kind of come together, because neither really has a handle on it completely, because no one studied cannabis long enough. And the issue with using terpenes as this guide, as to this terpene does this and this does this, is it applies to aromatherapy. But as soon as you apply it, there's zero testing on combustion. So when someone says that this terpene does this when you smell it, does not mean it's going to do that when you burn it.
You're right.
So, and so a lot of the information people use is extrapolated data. They take it from one side, apply it to another, and then they want it to be real because it saves you 20 years of research. But the bottom line is not accurate. And what we're doing, and when we're doing this, is we're taking people down a road where we're trying to explain to them that we know what we're doing. And the truth of it is we really don't. We only know, and we can only really say, of the 1,000 people I saw in this situation, the majority of them seem to do better with this treatment. Some seem to do poorly. So this way it gives them a clear picture, because the patient is the one we care about. It's not that we're right or wrong. It's the fact that the patient that comes to you is seeking assistance, and our job is to provide it in any way we can to the most accurate way possible. But when you get down to this, there's only been so many studies. So companies like Taxonomy out of Israel, they've done some extensive research on, we said, this particular problem, when we addressed it with this particular plant, we seem to find statistical evidence of increase of quality of life. And so when you work with the Mullen model, then you would then follow their SOPs, their protocols on how the plant was produced, because by changing production methodologies, we skew cannabinoids and secondary metabolites. So all we have to do is change it subtly, and it's no longer really the identical product. And that's why I like the unconverted acid methodologies, because we know that unconverted acid stimulate the endocannabinoid system so thoroughly that what it does, it allows the body to start working at a homeopathic level to start to look at the issue. And then we're able to find even better what the person needs once we get the basic level of health stable.
Okay. So I've got a question about well, genetics. And, you know, there's various companies that will do genetic testing. So they'll tell you you've got single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, in particular genes that would predispose you to, you know, certain diseases. For example, it could be cardiovascular disease. It might be predisposing me to anxiety. Do you think it might be possible now or in the future to match the cannabis medicines to various SNPs that have been detected in a test? Do you think that that's a possibility in terms of personalisation of medicine? I mean, we hear in Western medicine about precision medicine or personalised medicine, and look, I'm a Chinese medico, so personalising a prescription is what we do anyway. But I'm talking about when you jump down to this sort of level of trying to work out what's going on in a person. Have they got genetic predispositions to something? And if they have, could certain, I guess, cultivars be better for them than others? I guess I'm interested in your ideas on that.
Oh, I completely agree. And it's already begun, but it's begun at a more basic level where they've identified your cannabinoid receptors, and it allows them to do a DNA analysis of an individual. And then you would find out, are your receptors best stimulated by a high THC cultivar, a type 1, by high CBD, a type 2, or a 1-to-1, a mixed ratio, which is type 3. And we already have that ability. So as we start to understand the human genome better, then it would allow us to start matching these plants to people, so that what you had was a non-toxic solution to a health issue, which right now, it seems when we use normalized medicine, there's a whole cocktail of products that have to go along with it, because the product that helps you with your primary issue seems to have side effects that needs other drugs to countereffect those. Whereas with homeopathic medicine, you don't seem to have the toxicity. And so with the ability to identify what receptors, so we know where to target, and then the ability to start really looking at the genome in a more accurate manner and identifying, can we find the match? And I know that really is the future, to where we would all be able to start to have customized cannabis that would work best for us to give us the desired result.
Okay. Carolyn.
Well, you sort of answered my question about the categories. But what's your experience with how you see it in the US, with the role of medicinal cannabis prescribers as opposed to bud tenders in dispensaries?
Well, at one point in time, the dispensaries really were medical cannabis prescribers, so to speak, because they had the most exposure to individuals. The average person, if you have 20,000 people that you sell cannabis to, you probably have a pretty clear idea of what those 20,000 will ask for. Most individuals who have zero experience say they're experts. And so the bud tenders, if they're thoughtful and they have some homeopathic medicine idea, understanding, it'll allow them to be able to start to see the patterns.
Yep.
And what I see is with medical cannabis, it's dangerous because medical cannabis is the neediest group. And so you're desperate. Usually the people I dealt with it was rare that someone who sought, I'm here for a medical cannabis recommendation, they were never chipper and cheery about it. It was a very serious situation. And because of that, they're vulnerable to, I want to say, charlatans. And so what you have is a tremendous number of false experts in cannabis that proclaim themselves to be medicine geniuses. And I was very fortunate that I never had that background. And so what I did is I sought out homeopathic healers that had used cannabis as one of their preparations. And what it did is it allowed me to meet people who were in their 60s, 70s at the time that had 30, 40, 50 years of using herbalism to help people. And they approached cannabis with much the same manner. And so what it did is it allowed me to see better how you work with this unknown, because we don't have a clear guide. And so bud tenders can be very intelligent and can be very accurate, or they can also be young kids that just have a job selling at the counter. And that's not a bad thing. But what we tried to do was create, information banks so that when people wanted to know, they could at least go speak to somebody who had some real experience. The charlatanism is what killed me, because when people are desperate and they're fighting for the life of their life, the life of their child, and you screw them for money, you really have a very low rank to me. I just have very little respect for you. That the people that need the most gentle treatment are the ones that are most desperate. And with cannabis, because there's this potential to make money that's so great, it created a wave of these people, and it created a wave of disinformation that makes it confusing for people to really sift through and figure out what's right and what's not.
Okay, well, I think we're at the end of our time together, but Kevin, thanks so much. I could actually talk to you for hours, and I would love to have you back on our show at some point in the future, because, in just this 40 minutes, I have just learned such an incredible amount of information just listening to you. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Kevin.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. I'd love to be back on your show. No, the topics, they need to be covered, because what you have to be able to see is like what we really do know and what we don't. And
exactly.
That way, what we have to do is find the different groups to work together to uncover the truth, because ultimately we want to be able to have people get the best relationship with cannabis, because it's the most widely spread plant in human history. There's no plant that has a relationship with humans like cannabis. Most widely diffused, most incredibly chemically complex.
And interesting that it's coming back at a time when I think when we need it most right now, isn't it?
Truth.
So,
Truth.
Look, it's about education. It's about education of patients. Everyone deserves to understand about this, but we have set up an education platform called the ICCM for healthcare practitioners. So you can go to that platform, iccm.co, and it has a bank of educational videos for some of the top speakers, educators, clinicians from around the globe are talking about the evidence base of medicinal cannabis and how to prescribe it. So I'd encourage healthcare practitioners listening to this to go to the iccm.co. We've got a free foundation course there that you can sign up and do. And if you like what we've got there, you can subscribe and become a member and have access to all our videos. We are adding videos every month too. So again, thanks everyone for your attention and our Considering Cannabis podcast, and we look forward to you joining us for our next one. Thanks everyone.